Chapter 5. Another aspect of war. The world ebbed slowly back into existence. Reyes fought his way through the darkness back to consciousness. The back of his head felt as if a tree had hit it. He was lying on his front in the back of a flatbed cart, his knees tucked up under his stomach at an awkward angle. His hands had been thrust behind his back and tied together just above his tail, and his wings too had been chained behind his back to prevent any possibility that he might fly away. Reyes was naked except for the brown skirt of his regiment. Everything else he had been carrying, his bracelets, his bow, his belt, and the half-dozen or so arrows he had carried with him into battle, had been taken from him. Even his skirt felt a little weird. It was slightly loose, as if someone had checked it over for secret compartments or hidden valuables and hadn't bothered to replace it properly. Reyes' items, along with a large amount of loot taken from the recently dead, had been piled together at the front of the cart. It wasn't all that far from Reyes' nose, so he was able to get a fair look at it without having to move. It appeared to consist mainly of armour and weapons, but there were a few other items of interest. A small cloth sack that Reyes assumed was filled with all the money that the looters had been able to gather, and even a smaller jewellery box. The first thing Reyes did upon gaining consciousness was to try the bonds that were holding his hands tightly behind his back. Whatever it was that had been used to tie his hands together, it didn't feel like rope. He strained a little against the bond, but it refused to give. "It's awake," someone commented. There were at least two others sitting on the back of the cart with Reyes. They began to talk to each other. Perhaps they'd already been talking to each other about various things, but Reyes had been too out of it to notice. As Reyes stirred, the subject of their discussion seemed to turn to him. "She." "Huh? It's a she." "How can you tell? It's a harpy, they're all she's. I thought everyone knew that." "Well, she's awake then." It was quite an effort, but Reyes was able to tuck his knees in a little further towards his chest. This gave him the balance he needed to slowly raise his head from the floor of the cart. A task that would have been made so much easier if he had been able to use his hands. "Careful, she's stirring." Almost before Reyes was upright, there was a sword placed precariously just below his neck. The owner of the sword was, unsurprisingly, an elf. He wore the same chainmail armour that seemed to be stock equipment for virtually everyone in the elven army, but the clothing he wore underneath the armour looked casual, rather than part of an actual uniform. "Okay, darling, let's see if we understand each other. Any sudden move, and I'll slit your ugly little throat." The second elf on the back of the cart also wore chainmail armour and casual clothing, though one of the shoulder straps that held his armour in place had broken, causing the mail to sit unevenly on the elf's body. This second elf was watching every move Reyes made carefully, although he kept his sword firmly sheathed. As well as the two elves sitting on the back of the cart with Reyes, there was a third sitting at the front of the cart, driving it. This third elf seemed totally oblivious to anything that was going on behind his back. It simply wasn't his problem. Nor did this elf seem inclined to join in with the conversation. Reyes wasn't really in much of a position to resist anyway. Even the simplest of spells he knew needed a mudra, even if it didn't need spoken words, and with his hands tied behind his back, he couldn't even light a candle. The best he could do was to unsheath his claws, but even at their maximum length he couldn't reach the ties that bound his hands together. The mere act of unsheathing his claws seemed only to make the two elves even more nervous. The elf with the sword leaned forward even more menacingly, while the second elf even went so far as to rest his hand on the hilt of his own blade. Reyes put his claws away and rested gently back against one of the supporting edges of the cart. There was no point in antagonizing the elves when he had no way to escape. The act of withdrawing his claws did seem to calm the elves down a little. Even the one who had threatened to slit his throat relaxed. He rested the sword point down, between his legs, his hand still on the hilt, still ready to act at a moment's notice, but at least the blade wasn't right up against Reyes' neck anymore. As the journey continued, Reyes glanced up at the sky. The joy of flying permeated every fibre of his being. Somehow he doubted he'd ever be allowed to fly again, if the elves got their way. The cart was moving slowly through a forest, following an old dirt track created by hunters over hundreds of years of tracking game through these very forests. There was a lot of tree cover, the thick foliage of the trees growing on either side of the dirt track, mingling together in the heights and blocking out the sun. Even if Reyes was capable of telling the time by the relative position of the sun, it was hard to do so when the sun wasn't even visible. Where were they? Had he been unconscious for a few hours or just a few minutes? He began to have serious doubts that he would be able to get back to the castle in time for his appointment with the alderman. For some inexplicable reason, he began to think of his sister. He loved his sister. She would probably be happily married by now if it wasn't for that messenger that he insisted to send. It might be selfish, but Reyes still held out hope that he would be able to attend the wedding himself. The cart continued to trundle through the forest at a reasonably gentle speed, and before too much longer it emerged into the ruins of the village of the Moth. Clearly, they weren't too far from the castle then. Most of the buildings that had made up the village were little more than burnt-out husks. All the small cottages and shops had been burnt to the ground. There was little left of them but small piles of ash and the occasional precarious wall to indicate that anything had once stood there. Some of the larger buildings had survived slightly better. In some cases, the elves had even posted a few lookouts on the roofs of some of the more stable of these buildings. There were a large number of tents erected around the village. For the most part they appeared to be of a white material, as if the tents had been mass-produced. But there were a few distinctive differences. The largest of these tents stood just outside the remains of what had once been the village chapel, recognisable because the old bell tower still stood, although it was charred black and only had 3 sides. There was a pair of guards standing duty immediately outside the entrance of the tent. They were armed with both spears and swords, and like the 2 elves in the cart, they wore casual clothing under their chainmail armour. In the centre of the village, near the central apple tree that had once grown there and had been burnt down with the rest of the village, a small group of human women were busy cooking. They had lit a fire and were sitting nearby, cutting up vegetables and skinning animals to put in the pot. Judging by the number of elves Reyes could see in the village, their one little pot wasn't going to be enough. Standing nearby was an elf with a nasty-looking 9-tailed whip, keeping a careful eye on every little thing the women did. One other thing that caught Reyes' eye as the cart entered the confines of the village, there was a large cage with thick black bars, designed to withstand the strength of even the strongest of ogres. It was in front of this cage that the cart finally came to a stop. Reyes felt himself overbalanced a little with the inertia caused by the stop, but it wasn't enough to force him to fall back onto the cart. Again, there were 2 guards on duty here watching the door of the cage from a respectable distance. They were both armed with sword and spear, and like the other elves Reyes had seen about the camp, they wore chainmail armour, but had no uniform underneath. The cage itself was already full of creatures of various races. When the cart had first arrived in the village, a number of these creatures pushed themselves towards the bars in order to get a better look of the newcomer. Some of these left after only a couple of seconds, their expressions turned to disappointment. A few, though, stayed to watch. It was as if life in the cage was so dull that anything different was worthy of some attention. There had to be at least a couple of 100 in the cage already. Reyes had wondered where the rest of the hope had gone. Here was his answer. More than half of those in the cage were still wearing at least part of the brown uniforms of the Hope. They had been stripped of armour and weapons and left only enough clothing to keep them decent. Among the prisoners were harpies. They hadn't all died during the battle after all. He only saw one harpy and he didn't recognise her, but she still wore the same brown armband and skirt of the Hope. As well as the Hope, there were close to 100 human prisoners in the cage. Most of them were wearing nothing but underwear, so it was hard to tell if they had fought at the castle and then been sold on as slaves, or if they had been found in the nearby woods trying to escape from one of the nearby villages. Reyes thought he recognised a couple of the soldiers that used to serve under his father. The humans had been put in the same cage as the survivors of the Hope. They were all keeping pretty much to themselves, but surprisingly, neither side seemed to be at each other's throats. It was as if they realised they were all in the same boat. Indeed, they might even have been willing to talk if only they could understand what the other was saying. The driver of the cart dropped the reins and descended from the cart. He walked over to where the 2 elves stood guard, but he ignored them both. Instead, he walked over to a nearby tabletop that had one slightly burnt leg. Resting on this table was an old horn. The horn was covered with the dirt of 1,000 hands and had never been cleaned. The driver didn't seem to care how dirty the horn was. He put it to his mouth and blew a loud single note. Almost immediately there was activity elsewhere in the camp. A number of elves began to emerge from the smaller tents and from behind buildings. It seemed as if the elves were taking no chances with their prisoners. Reyes counted at least 8 approaching from the various corners of the village. One of these 8 was wearing very rich clothes, and instead of the chainmail armour that seemed to be so standard for these elves, he wore no armour at all. The elf seemed to be armed with nothing more than a small dagger and what appeared to be a walking stick. Reyes looked closely at this elf, thinking he had to be a mage of some description. Other things were happening closer to home. One of the elves who had been on the back of the cart with Reyes, the one who had threatened to slit his throat, said, "Okay, darling, I want you to climb off the cart and onto the ground." "I'll try," Reyes replied. Then hopefully he added, "It would be easier if you untied my hands." The elf grinned. "Look, love, do I look like I was born yesterday? Get off the cart." "I don't care if you fall off, just get off the cart." The elf then aimed a hefty kick at Reyes' chest. Pain exploded in Reyes' chest as the elf's foot connected. It was a well-aimed blow, intended to cause as much pain as possible without actually causing any real damage. Reyes winced with the pain and then clambered off the cart as best he could before the elf kicked him again. Reyes landed in a crumpled heap at the back of the cart. It was awkward with his hands bound, but slowly he straightened up and tried to climb to his feet. The second elf on the cart, the one with the loose shoulder strap, was by Reyes' side in a second. He grabbed Reyes under the shoulders and forcibly helped him to his feet. Reyes turned his attention back to the approaching mage. The mage's staff looked to be of quite a basic design. There was nothing ornate about it, and it seemed to have been made from fairly cheap wood. It was as if the mage had spent all his money on his clothing and nothing on the symbols of his office. Nevertheless, the mage did carry himself as if he was someone who expected to be obeyed. It was therefore quite a surprise to Reyes when it was one of the other elves approaching him who spoke first. "What's this, just one harpy?" the elf asked. His voice didn't fit in with the elf's appearance. His accent sounded too upper class to be a bandit or a slaver. There was nothing special in the way this elf was dressed that would mark him out as the leader. He wore the same type of chainmail armour as the others, and also, like the others, he wore casual clothing under his armour. Rough, yellow clothing that looked more suited to a farmer than a leader. "Just one, boss," one of the elves on the back of the cart commented. "Everyone else has already been brought to you." "Okay," the boss said. He nodded to the speaker. "We'll take the prisoner from here." He pointed towards a large tent, continuing, "You three get the cart over to my tent and start unloading the loot." "Yes, boss," the elf replied. He climbed back on board the flatbed of the cart with his companion, the driver taking the seat at the front of the cart. A mere moment or two later, the three were heading towards a large tent. As Reyes watched the cart leave and followed its path to the tent with his eyes, he couldn't help but notice another elf emerging from one of the white tents. The elf waited for the cart to pass and then crossed a short distance to the cooking fire. Here, he walked up to one of the women and grabbed her by the arm. The woman let out a horrified scream. "No! Leave me alone! No! No!" She continued to scream in this vein. The elf carrying the whip began to laugh. The elf that had grabbed the woman's arm began to drag her back towards his tent. Reyes felt sorry for the woman. He would have liked to have gone straight over there to save her from her ordeal, but right now he felt powerless. With his wings and his hands tied together, and no less than 10 elves gathered nearby, one of whom was a mage, Reyes doubted he would survive to take a second step. The leader cared nothing for what was going on behind him. He turned his attention only to the elves gathered near him. "We have done well this past day. I expect our people will have stripped this battlefield clean by tonight. Tomorrow morning I think it best if we split into 2 groups. Gamaran, you would take half the men and follow the army south of the city the locals call Lamington. There should be some rich pickings there." He rested his hand on the shoulder of one of the other elves, indicating which one was Gamaran. "And more slaves," someone commented. "And more slaves," the boss agreed. "The rest of us will be heading back to Goldspawn to sell what slaves we can and to exchange the loot for hard cash. We will catch up with Gamaran as soon as we are able." There were a few murmured agreements among the other elves. "I know," the boss motioned. "It would be easy if we could convince them to eat something first." "They know what our food will do to them," commented one of the other elves. "They'll have to eat something eventually," said a third, "unless they're willing to starve to death." "Right," the boss commented. He briefly rubbed his hands together as if brushing away the dust of his intentions and stepped over to Reyes. "Let's see what we have here." The elf began to walk around Reyes, examining him in the same way Reyes might have examined a horse. The elf grabbed hold of Reyes' forearm, commenting, "She seems strong enough. I'll bet she was a good huntress in her day." Then he crouched down and looked at Reyes' legs and feet. Good strong feet, more muscular than is normal for a harpy. And these feet, they look like they've seen a lot of walking recently. Boss," one of the other elves commented, "she does seem to have this bruise on one of her wings. Maybe it's stopping her from flying." "Really?" The boss stood up and examined the wing closely. He ran his hand over the injury, making Reyes wince with pain. The boss then slapped the wing just below the wound. Reyes couldn't stop himself. He cried out with a sudden surge of pain and almost fell over as he instinctively tried to move away from the boss. He had a strong feeling of anguish that the elf might hit him there again. "It doesn't look much," the boss said, "but it does seem to be causing her some discomfort." He patted Reyes gently on the shoulder and injected a slight patronising tone as he said, "Don't worry, dear. We'll soon fix it." The boss stepped back from Reyes and ordered, "Bolita, fix her wing." The mage didn't reply. He just stepped forward and began to examine the bruise. He seemed to be looking at it for quite a few minutes before he spoke at all. "There's nothing I can do, boss. This wing is broken." "Nothing you can do?" the boss asked. "I can't repair broken bones, boss. You know that," the mage commented. "You're sure it's broken?" the boss asked. "Positive." "You might be able to elicit the services of an inquisitor to mend it for you. I think there might still be a couple at the castle. The best I can do is wrap it in bandages and hope it heals naturally over time." The boss shook his head. "Even if we could talk an inquisitor into casting such a spell for us, I'd expect the cost to far outweigh the benefits. She'll have to put up with having a broken wing for now." "I'll get the bandages," Bolita commented. "Not now," the boss insisted. "Do that later. I need you to check through the last lot of loot and check for anything that might carry an enchantment before we share it out. You can bandage her up later." "Right, boss," Bolita agreed, his expression one of boredom. "Right then," the boss said as he looked at one of the guards that had been watching the cage door when the cart had pulled into the village. "Open the cage. I'll prepare the prisoner." The guard that the boss had just spoken to walked over to the cage door and shouted to those already in the cage, "Okay, I want everyone to move away from the door." Most of those in the cage obeyed the order immediately. Many, who were still hovering on the side of the cage nearest the door, began to retreat further into the cage. A few others stayed pretty much where they were. Most of these were human, and probably hadn't understood the command. A few of the humans were able to take their cues from the actions of those around them, but others seemed quite slow on the uptake. "I said get back," the guard ordered. He smashed the shaft of his spear hard against the cage, almost on top of where one of the human prisoners had settled. "I want everyone to step away from the door." Then with his spear in his right hand, he motioned the others back with his left. There could be no doubt in the elf's meaning this time, and even those who couldn't speak Elistran began to move back from the cage door. The guard didn't open the door yet. Instead, there was another quick ritual to be performed first. Bolita, the elven mage, stepped towards the cage door. Once there, he examined the lock carefully while mumbling something almost incoherent under his breath. Reyes listened carefully, trying to get at least the gist of what the mage was saying, but it was no good. He might as well have been talking gibberish for all Reyes was able to understand. Then, at the height of the mumbling, Bolita pointed his finger at the lock and touched the metal just slightly. He stood there for a moment just looking at the lock, and then stepped away from the cage. He nodded briefly to the guard, and then to the boss. The guard pulled out a single rusty black key and inserted it into the lock. A mere moment later, he was pushing the cage door open. It was a low door. Anyone passing through that door, in or out, would have to bow low to get through it. It meant it was virtually impossible for the prisoners to rush the elves. Nevertheless, the elves that were gathered by the cage prepared their weapons. It didn't do to take chances. The boss of the elves walked over to Reyes again. This time he placed a hand on Reyes' shoulder and spun him around. Reyes could feel the release of tension as the boss then undid the rope that was binding his hands together. "Okay, love. I'm sure you feel that you'd like to strike out against us while you can. I'd like to point out the archers on the nearby buildings, who are even now preparing to shoot you should you try anything." "I understand," Reyes replied. "Good," the boss said, taking a step back. "Are you going to free my wings?" Reyes asked. "Remove the wing cuffs, you mean?" "No, sweetie. You can keep those. It's not like you can fly away anyway, not with that wing." The boss emphasised his comment by patting Reyes on the damaged wing. Reyes winced with the pain. "Okay," the boss called. "Put her in."